Okay, so hi everyone. Before we begin, how was your guys' weekend?
Good.
Was it good? Good?
Hmm.
Good.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so just getting right into it. Today we're going to be talking about figurative language. And I promise that this lesson will be interesting and we're not just going to be like talking about what is a simile or like what is a metaphor because when you're writing, I feel like the more important thing is that you actually know how to use these literary devices, like similes, metaphors. It doesn't really matter so much the definition, but oftentimes as a writer, you're not necessarily going like, oh, at this specific point, I need to use a simile, or you're not exactly kind of mapping it out like that. You're instead using it instinctually, and using it where it sounds good. And that's kind of what we're going to be working on today, kind of developing more of that sense. And then we'll start talking a little bit about our portfolio project. And I think we're gonna start talking about it week 5 or week 6. But at the very, very end of class, there's going to be a homework assignment relating to the portfolio. So number one, I hope you guys remember that that's a thing. And number two, I hope you'll be excited for it because it's not meant to be some like very big, burdensome project. Um, so for the portfolio, really try to just put your best effort into it and then create a cohesive collection of things that you can hopefully use for other things like competitions, if you want to submit to other literary magazines, stuff like that. And then one more thing, I know we're reading a lot of kind of like Asian culture pieces, and I don't really know why that is. I think it's just because whenever I go looking for something that'll kind of work very, very well for a lesson, it's always typically a culture piece. But starting from next week, I'll try to actively not choose culture pieces, because we probably need some more variety. But the piece we're reading today, which is called Asymmetry, that's still kind of like a culture piece, like we read last week. So we're not necessarily going to stay like completely away from culture pieces, but I'm gonna try out some new stuff in the later weeks. So this is the table of contents. We're going to kind of do a homework review, or not so much homework review, but kind of reviewing what we talked about last class. And then we're going to jump into our main lesson, and then some practice if we have time, and then some homework. Okay, so I'm going to do a review of last week, which was kind of dense. So I have a few questions for you guys. And the first question is, this one is hopefully pretty easy, but why do we read other people's writings? Like, do you guys have any idea why we might do that? I think Ali, you can go first.
Mm, maybe just to entertain ourselves when we're bored and
But like as a writer, why might it be important to like get a better sense or read other people's writing?
get ideas.
hmm Yeah, so long story short, if you don't read other people's writing, you won't be able to really grow or like get better, which is really important if we want to be able to write good. And it also gives us ideas that we can kind of base our own writing off of, and also inspiration as well. And that's why I try to incorporate like a reading into almost every single class. So I know we won't be reading Lord of the Flies because I haven't found a way to kind of fit that into a lesson, because this is kind of a new workshop course and I'm still kind of experimenting. But if you really, really want to read Lord of the Flies and if you feel like that it'll inspire you somehow or like change your life, then please let me know. But the reason why we read a lot of small pieces every class is so that we can kind of get inspired, and then you can kind of try out something new and base that off of what we read in class. And then Alvin, what do you think an author's identity is?
I don't know.
Okay. So an author's identity is basically like who the author is, right? So we can break it into more specific pieces, about like what the author is made up of almost. And that's basically like the author's themes, like what ideas do they write around? What motifs do they use? What are some recurring objects or symbols that they like to incorporate into their writing? And then finally also style, what format do they write in? And stuff like that. So that's basically a more comprehensive overview of how a author writes, what they like to write about, and how they do so. And then, Ali, do you know how an author might like build up their identity?
Mm, not really.
Okay. So basically, an author can really build up the identity by writing about things that they find important or things that they find exciting. So that could be honestly anything. So you should really just try to write about anything that you want to write about. So for example, even if it's very silly, if you really have a desire to write about, Draco Malfoy from the Harry Potter series, if you write about something that you really want to write about, you could end up producing really great writing. And that's kind of what happened to J.K. Rowling, right? And another way to kind of build up your own identity is by what we talked about before, which is looking into other authors and looking into other pieces of writing, and essentially by reading, right? It helps you build up what you are, what you like, and then you can kind of see if you want to emulate certain authors or if you like their styles or what they touch on, or maybe specifically how they write. All those things can kind of influence you in your own way. And then so we talked about kind of the tree of the two authors last class. And you don't really need to know everything about the tree or like what goes on in it, but essentially you should be able to know that you can break down authors' works, and really kind of absorb part of them into your own work. And you're not actually literally absorbing anyone, and it's not like creepy or sci-fi or anything like that. You're more so absorbing their ideas. And then it's also about practice, right? Practice and just writing more and more, which is exactly what we'll be doing in class. And then the final part of the homework review is Amanda Gorman. So you guys hopefully research her for homework, but she's the National Youth Poet Laureate. And she writes a lot about topics focusing on political issues, like racism, feminism, climate change. And the book that we read, which is Call Us What We Carry, that's mostly about quarantine and isolation and kind of during that 2020 period. And she also likes to write about courage, love, and hope. And she's very famous or like very notable for spoken word poetry, which is essentially poetry that's spoken, so it's slightly different. Um, in spoken word poetry, it's a lot more about how things sound rather than the literal imagery. So we'll be quickly taking a look at one of Amanda Gorman's spoken word pieces, and kind of talking about it. So we'll be looking at her piece, The Hill We Climb, which she actually read for the inauguration for Joe Biden. And it's kind of long, it's like 6 minutes, so we'll only watch up to the 2 minute mark. And then we'll kind of comment on what she does really well as a poet, whether it's like literary devices, or her ideas. And then that will kind of segue us hopefully nicely into our current topic, which is figurative language. So I'm going to see if I can, my monitor is like flicking on and off every like 5 minutes. No, not every 5 minutes, every like few seconds. So I can like, I have to look at my shared screen to see like kind of what I'm sharing. Oh,
Mr. President, Dr.
oh,
Biden.
let me see if I can. Um, Technical difficulties. Okay, so we'll just play from here then. And this is Amanda Gorman, by the way. Okay.
Mr.
Can you guys hear that? Okay.
President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. In the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew. That even as we hurt, we hope.
Okay, so that was 2 minutes. Well, if you guys want to watch more of that, you can watch it on your own time. How do I exit out of this? Okay. Let me stop sharing. Okay. So hopefully that was pretty interesting. She was actually chosen. I think there are like many applications to speak, and she was the one chosen. So I think that says a lot about her poetry in general and her ability to um, wait. I still. I'm sorry for these technical difficulties. Okay. So, yeah, so I guess I want to ask you guys, what are some things that you notice, whether it's like kind of the way she speaks or the language that she's using in her piece? You guys can like type in the chat or you could just speak out loud. Like, what are things we noticed during her performance? Hand gestures? Talks like in a poem? Okay. Yeah, so hand gestures is definitely like I think that's more of the performance aspect when we're talking about like spoken word poetry. You can kind of have like more emotion or like more gestures or like symbolism when you're physically there and people can see like your hand gestures and your body language. Um, yeah, I think yeah, toxic in the poem. Yeah, that is very accurate because she is reading a poem after all. And spoken word poetry is still poetry. But a few things that I wanted to point out specifically about her piece is the rhythm. So there's definitely a rhythm to the way she kind of speaks. And one thing that's really, really important to spoken word poetry, I'd say more important than regular just written poetry, is the idea of rhythm. So like, how do things sound when they're said out loud? Um, and then another key aspect is this idea of metaphor, and more specifically using metaphors and rhymes to do wordplay. So, for example, if you can see on the slide, I have the transcript of what she said. But like things like notions of what just is isn't always justice. It's only like a slight shift between just is and justice, but the way she kind of compares those or like just juxtaposes them side by side, really, even though they're kind of so different, it makes them seem very meaningful and interesting. And then we can also see she uses a lot of alliteration. Like we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken but simply unfinished. So it happens on subtle levels. Obviously, weathered and witnessed and we is kind of obvious. But then there's also rhyme between witnessed and unfinished. And I don't really remember if it's like a half rhyme or like a slant rhyme, but I know it's a type of rhyme. And then kind of when you go farther into the poem, it almost gets stronger. And like she kind of eases you in, and then she's almost like, so this poem is called The Hill We Climb, and she's almost like climbing a literal hill as she goes into the poem. And then there's this use of we. So that presents this image of like hope and like we must work together. And then since we don't really have much time, we can quickly look at this poem that you read for homework, which is called Essex One. And it's also personally my favorite piece in this book, and what made me really like her work. And if I was to read it out loud, it'd be like, take a tragedy, write a book, look. Only when we're drowning do we understand how fierce our feet can kick. So again, we notice that continuity of repetition, right? You can see book and look is a rhyme. And then there's also alliteration between how fierce our feet and also can kick. Um, that's also alliteration. And then there's a contrast of like drowning and also fighting for your life. So, in general, when you're thinking about your own work, you want to think about how you can kind of use wordplay to contribute, and how also alliteration and rhyme can really make your poem interesting and exciting to a listener or to a reader. And with that, hopefully, that's a good segue into our actual lesson, which is on figurative language. So here's a quick pre-question, and it's kind of boring. I personally don't really like boring questions. So if you want to just answer by giving an example of figurative language as opposed to just stating the elements, that's completely fine as well. But just I want you guys to take maybe like a minute or two to talk about what are the elements of figurative language. And you can also name like a figurative language device, which is like maybe simile and metaphor are obvious ones, but there are so many more. So you can just like type in the chat or you can just unmute and say it out loud.
Mm, there's hyperboles, in other words, extreme exaggerations.
Yeah,
Like,
definitely.
I'm going to eat a million hot dogs.
I'm so hungry I could eat a horse.
Yeah. Although I'm pretty sure that's a metaphor or something.
Symbolism.
hmm Is there anything more specific, like a specific type of symbolism? I'm not sure if there's um like personification. I'm not that's kind of symbolism,
Oh,
but yeah,
remember another one.
Uh,
It's an allusion. Like
illusion.
taking mythical figures and then using them as figurative language.
hmm Yeah, I think an illusion is like a reference to something else, like another work. Um, Maybe if you were to reference like a Shakespeare play, that would be an allusion to something else. Yeah. Anything else, like anything more traditional that you guys learned in school?
Simile and metaphor.
hmm Yeah. hmm Yeah, I think that's basically a good list of things. Like we have metaphor, simile, hyperbole, imagery. I don't know if you guys said imagery, like symbolism, personification is a good example as well. So yeah, so there's a lot of good things like that. Alliteration, there's also irony. Um, but
Oh, like being sarcastic.
yeah, being sarcastic. Uh-huh. So in general, figurative language is used to kind of accomplish a certain tone, or emphasize a certain idea, or basically convey the meaning of a story or a poem. And I have a really bad metaphor for figurative language later on. Um, so we'll get a little bit more into that. But anyway, so figurative language, you can kind of break figurative language down into categories, if you want, looking at how different things accomplish different purposes. So, for example, simile, metaphor, and personification, these are often used for either comparison or kind of revealing broader ideas and themes. So, if you were to say, like, his smile is like death when talking about Draco Malfoy, we're going to get that association with death. And if you want to do repetition, some of the really common ones are alliteration and anaphora. So, do you guys know what anaphora is?
No.
Okay. Anaphora is essentially when you repeat the beginning of every sentence. So, for example, in the previous poem, Amanda Gorman's The Hill We Climb, we saw a lot of repetition of we, right? So, like, we can do this, we can do that. And anaphora is essentially when you repeat the beginning of every sentence. So, using we over and over again would be an example of anaphora. So, you basically start a sentence the same way every time to kind of create that emphasis and rhythm. And then diction is basically the language you use. So if you're talking about harvest, maybe you're using imagery of wheat and a plow in a field. That would all play into the repetition of this idea. And then the same thing with motif. If you talk about an apple over and over again, people are going to get to the point that they believe that the apple is important in some type of way. And then finally, it can just be used for wordplay. So wordplay can serve on a lot of different levels. On the surface level, it makes your piece a little bit more interesting, but it also draws attention to where the reader should pay attention, where are the thematic cruxes or concentrations of your writing, and it can also be used for a lot of purposes. And as I said before, I want to make sure that we're not having you guys kind of memorize specific devices or like be like in today's homework we're going to use one simile, two metaphors, three pieces of diction because I feel like that's really not how writing works. So instead we're going to be going over simile, metaphor, etc., and we're going to be looking at how we can use them effectively and ineffectively rather than just memorizing the definition. So here are the kind of ugly common mistakes that we typically make with figurative language. So the first thing is summary. So summary is when you basically have no figurative language at all and you're just simply stating what's happening. So this is basically the absence of figurative language. And actually, this is not technically a bad thing always, because when you're using summary, it's good to help you kind of balance out the figurative language with the non-figurative parts. And sometimes at the beginning of the story, you need exposition, right, to kind of situate your reader in the place. Um, and it really allows the readers to know which moments are important by having something a little bit more literally bland compared to a paragraph with lots of figurative language. You can kind of tell the reader what they should focus on. And then um, yeah, so but everything's an active balance. If your whole piece is just Draco walked down the street holding an apple, the apple is red and bright. Draco really liked the apple. Then it gets kind of tiring, right? And it's really boring and unexciting. And so you really need some figurative language to kind of jazz up that piece. And then the opposite of that is excessive or superfluous description. So this is when you have too much description. And this is where you're really going overboard with the language to the extent where it actually obscures what you're trying to say. So if you're describing something so much that the reader has no idea what you're even saying or what you're doing, then that's probably not a good sign. And then another thing to look out for is cliche. So cliche is basically like overused language, like his eyes were like the sun, or his eyes were ocean blue, or like I was finally at peace. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you use a lot of cliches, then number one, your reader has already seen it before, and so it's like not that interesting. And then number two, you want to be kind of original with language, like we talked about before. You're trying to really reinvent language, how you use language. Um, but when you use cliches, you're just using what you already know, what someone else has already thought of. So in this class, we're trying to break those cliches and we're trying to kind of avoid them in general because they're just kind of boring. And you can actually use cliches very well, but these are just standard rules and there are always exceptions. Another one is exaggeration. So describing things in a way that makes it seem unrealistic. There's um there's basically only one case where kind of exaggeration is considered. So or not considered is encouraged. So do you guys have any idea where someone might want to use exaggeration?
Like maybe in debate if they have a really strong opinion on something.
Hmm. Yeah, that could be one where you're trying to kind of like push the extent of their logic by making a very hyperbolic example. Yeah, is there any other genre of writing? Alvin, do you have an idea?
To show a point,
To show a
increase
point. Mhm.
intention.
Yeah, that's definitely another kind of going into the debate aspect, kind of like pushing their logic. Another one I was thinking of was like satire, humor, drama. And these are kind of three categories where exaggeration is kind of the purpose, right? Like drama is just really dramatic in general. And you'll see a lot of that type of hyperbolistic exaggeration, a lot of that type of language in drama. And then satire and humor, because exaggeration is also kind of the purpose of those types of pieces. Um, but if you're trying to be super serious and you're exaggerating everything, that kind of makes it humorous, right? If you're reading something so over the top, that makes it funny. So if you're writing something serious, you don't want to exaggerate something unless you're trying to be funny. Um, so yeah, and then repetition and wordiness. So this is when you have a bunch of non-deliberate redundancies. So we talked about how you can use repetition as a device, but if you're not using that deliberately and you're just kind of saying the same thing over and over again, but in different words, it can kind of clutter up the flow of the piece. And you want to make sure that, I know we talked about economy in a few classes ago. You want to make sure that every single word and every single phrase earns its place, right? You don't want it to just be like fluff. You want your piece to be as brief and as, not brief, but like every word earns its place, and brevity is very important. So those are just some common mistakes and things to kind of be wary about when we're talking about figurative language. Okay, so now we're going to do a fun activity, and just pretend I am a new fiction writer. I just started writing fiction and I'm very excited. And I'm writing this piece about chess. And this is a situation, not the real thing, because if I just started writing, then I probably wouldn't be teaching this class. But let's say my name is Joe and I'm writing about a chess game. And these are some lines that I picked out from my chess piece that I think are really good. So this is like my best work. Okay, so I want to become a writer. Joe wants to become a writer, and he's writing about a chess game, and you're going to try to convince Joe of why each of these lines is bad in some way. So kind of looking back at the common mistakes we talked about, each of these lines exemplifies one of those common mistakes. So you guys have to kind of um, figure out which mistake each line exemplifies. So that's like summary, excessive description, cliche, exaggeration, or repetition and wordiness. So your job is to kind of tell Joe what he did wrong and why it's wrong. So let's start off with the first one. So the first one says, I held my round, knobbed hands over the white ivory chess piece, looking softly and sweetly into the far distance. So, Ali, do you have any idea why this is bad? And I can go back to the previous slide if you want to look at the other of the mistakes.
I think there was too much description.
Okay, you can go. Bye, Alvin. I'll post the homework. Too much description? Yeah, that's definitely close. Let me see if I can go back to the other side. Yeah. So there's kind of another one though. Maybe if you can look at like specific, like I held my round knobbed hands like white ivory and then far distance. Is there something that like you noticed about kind of what they're saying? Maybe if you look at kind of the mistakes.
Well, I think round and knobbed are basically the same thing.
Hmm. Yeah. And what about ivory and white?
Ivory and white. Well, ivory is white, so you really don't need to describe it that much.
Uh-huh. And then like far distance.
If you are talking about the distance, it is far.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, this is the answer is like wordiness or redundancy, right? So far and distance mean the same thing, like you said. White and ivory are the same thing. Round and knobs are maybe like slightly different, but why do we need them both here? So you could honestly just cut them down to like, I held my knobbed hands over the ivory chess piece, looking softly into the distance. And that would be a lot better, but maybe not Pulitzer Prize winning work, but Joe's trying his best.
Better.
Is better, yeah. So, okay, the next one. The next one says, No, this can't be. Sobbing, I dropped the chess piece I'd clutched in my hand, watching it clatter to the ground like the last beats of a dying butterfly. So tell me what's wrong with my writing. I think it's the best writing I've ever done.
Not really.
Oh,
Wait, can I go back to the writing again?
yeah. Just to remind you, there's summary, excessive description, cliche, exaggeration, or repetition and wordiness. But we already did repetition and wordiness, so.
I'm pretty sure that the first quote is used pretty often, but I'm not quite sure.
Is there anything else you noticed maybe about like sobbing, dying butterfly?
Didn't really notice anything else.
Okay. So this one is bad because it's like very melodramatic, right? Like
Mhm.
that's good in some types of writing, but if Joe's writing is like a personal piece, this is going to get people to take him a lot less seriously because like the last beats of a dying butterfly, like that's a little dramatic, right? So that's like one thing. Um, but yeah, you're right. This can't be is also kind of like cliche. So that's a good thing to notice as well. Okay, the third one. My opponent sneered, looking at me with cat-like eyes. I felt lost, lost in the game we were playing. So this one's kind of hard, honestly. I don't think I did a great job, um, kind of picking the specific mistake that this one exemplifies. But
Hmm.
so what we have left is, um, I think we have cliche, exi not summary, excessive description, cliche.
Mhm. I think this one's kind of cliche because cat-like eyes is sometimes used. Well, it's used pretty often.
Yeah, spot on, correct. So yeah, I couldn't come up with too good of a cliche, but cat-like eyes, I guess was good enough that you caught that. And so this is kind of an example of how cliche kind of makes things sound like overdone or repetitive. Okay, the next one is looking over the crystal-like chessboard with its pieces shimmering like rich diamonds and night black diamonds. I took my dull-looking queen, gently placing her onto the board as the clouds above thundered hesitantly, as if the whole world was watching, with cloudy storms awaiting my opponent's move. What do you think that one is?
Uh, Excessive description, and also the description is just wrong. Because if the pieces shimmer, why is the queen dull?
hmm Yeah, that's completely correct, right? Like if it's glittering, then why is your queen dull? There are just like a lot of questions. Why do we need to know about the whole world watching with cloudy storms? It's just
Mhm.
like very excessive in general. So great job with that one. And then finally, the last one is saying good game. I shook my opponent's hand and walked out of the chess game holding my medal. I'd won the chess award that I had always wanted. I was so happy.
Underuse of description because A is the only one that we have left, and it's pretty bland.
Yeah, so this is summary. Right, it's just saying what's happened. You can do that, Joe, if you want, but it's not very literary or like interesting. Okay, so now Joe has gone back. He's a little bit sad, but now he knows how to improve his writing. So thank you for helping Joe. Okay, so now we're going to talk about when do we use figurative language overall. But first, here's my bad metaphor. So there will be one of these every other week, unfortunately. But essentially, you want to use figurative language like how you use makeup. And I don't know if this makes sense to you, but and it probably wouldn't make sense to Alvin. But if you've looked or if you've seen makeup or you know kind of what it's like to put a layer of blush all over your face,
Mhm.
even James Charles wouldn't put rainbow eyeshadow all over his entire face, right? Do you know who James Charles is?
No.
James, okay. He's basically this like YouTuber that specializes in makeup.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Get
even he wouldn't put like rainbow highlighter all over his entire face, right?
I get the point. Don't
Mhm.
overuse makeup. Don't overuse figurative language.
Nice one. Yeah, but mostly if you're going out and you want to look cool, you're going out to prom and you want to kind of put something on your eyes to have them pop. So you want to focus on like those, right? Like your eyes, for example. And essentially you're not putting it all over your face. You're putting it in the areas that really count or the areas that you really want to stand out, whether that's your eyes, your lips, and then everything else is kind of secondary to that. So it's kind of the same with figurative language as you kind of pointed out. So your kind of fancy highlights, your lipsticks, your colors, you should really try to concentrate those in those important areas. So just like when you're using figurative language, you want the language to be concentrated in areas of importance. And I think the easiest way to do this, and the way that Scholastic really likes, is to really carry an image throughout the piece. And the easiest way to do that is without even have to think about it, is put it emphasis on it at the beginning and at the end. So, um, basically, if you have that emphasis in the beginning and the end, it makes it very easy for you to follow an idea throughout your piece. There's like a single idea, like, oh, how this object, for example, the ocean, has changed since the beginning and the end of the story. So that kind of helps you map out the overall change of the author's main points by examining the transformation of one object from the beginning to the end. And it's also nice to call back into certain ideas. For example, if you use pink eyeshadow up here and you're not going to have like orange lipstick down here, that shows that you're not being very thoughtful in your writing. Like if you have pink eyeshadow up here and then orange lipstick here, it's not like the same. It like doesn't have a change. But if everything is very coordinated and it looks good, that means you're calling back to certain ideas that you saw previously. So if you have some like pink here and some like pink here, then you're referencing something that you previously used. And now I'm realizing the extent of this metaphor is not very great, but just bear with me. But like just how you kind of you're doing that on your face, that makes it you seem like you're thoughtful, like you planned it out. If you have that in your writing, for example, if you were to mention like a bird briefly in the first sentence, and then at the ending there's like a baby bird or like an egg or like a feather or something that calls back to that initial image, then it shows you're really being thoughtful with your use of figurative language. And then as for general imagery and language, you should use it throughout, but again, it's about that concentration in important areas. So you want to put the language where it matters most. And this is where you're introducing something with symbolic significance. So adding like a sly metaphor, any sorts of imagery will kind of heighten like, oh, that's what needs to stand out. That's what I need to pay attention to. That's what's important. And it can also represent a turning point. So for example, um, weather is kind of commonly used as a symbol. So if you see the weather getting brighter or lighter, then it typically means something good, right? If it's getting darker, then someone might die in that story. So you kind of want to be careful about how it is you're using general imagery, even though it seems like you can use it wherever you want. It's also being used to indicate important ideas. And then remembering to be economical, you only want to highlight one area, right? It only seems important or necessary if it's used sparingly, so it will really pop out in certain ideas or certain areas. And then finally, wordplay. So in poems, your words create a lot of meaning, right? But you can also use it a lot throughout the piece because poetry is often dense, this dense collection of words. You don't have to worry about economy as long as it means something and it adds to the overall vibe. But in general, regardless of what devices you're using, what you want to do is number one, create contrast. And then number two, create complexity. So those are kind of along the same line. And then number three, create highlight. So you're making certain parts of the text stand out more than others. So now we're going to be doing our weekly reading. This piece is called Asymmetry, and I can let you read it on your own quietly. And then while you're doing that, I want you to try to answer at least one of the questions on the right in the chat, or we can just say them out loud. And then we'll kind of read it and then annotate it together. So once you're done, you can just say the question out loud, or you can give me a thumbs up so I know you're finished.
I'm done.
Okay, perfect. So how do you feel about this piece?
Mm.
It is pretty dense, so I think as you kind of read a little more closely, it'll make more sense.
Well, the part where narrator's mom's hands went wild is pretty descriptive.
Hmm. And then what do you think this piece is like centered around?
Like difference of family members? I don't know.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk a little bit more about that together. And these are my annotations. Um, but yeah, so um, do you have any thought of like does the piece remind you of anything from your own life? Like, do you cut your hair symmetrically, asymmetrically?
I don't cut my hair.
You don't, or like your parents,
Yeah.
you want a symmetric haircut?
Well, typically, I
Yeah.
just want it to look like it's been complete. It, it just growed completely naturally like that.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, this is like a short fiction piece. And you guys will be writing something similar for homework. Um, so just one long paragraph, and I know I normally say like don't do this. It's bad to have like just a huge chunk of words. But sometimes exceptions can be made. And it's also only like a 200 to 300 word piece, so I think that's fine. But first of all, let's start off by kind of establishing what the main piece of imagery in this piece is. So, do you know what that might be?
Mm,
Like the main theme. And like an obvious hint is that it's in the what's this piece called?
asymmetry, so I guess it's about asymmetry.
Yep. So like based on that, the piece is kind of centered about the concept of like symmetry or asymmetry, basically like balance, right? And the title does give a lot away about the writing. So, how do we see the author doing things we talked about in regards to figurative language? One thing I noticed personally is that she ends her story with asymmetry. So, we talked about how you should kind of start and end your story with like a same thing, like callback, or like the circular moment. And she does a really good job opening and closing with asymmetry. And then, yeah, did you notice any like motifs that she had throughout the piece, or like it's kind of obvious, but like any motifs?
Wait, so are motifs things that the story is basically centered around?
Like little objects or like ideas that just reappear throughout.
Uh, hair cutting?
Hair cutting, maybe people like her dad.
Hmm.
Yeah, so what she does here is she kind of calls back to her father, right? And then what that does is number one, it's like, oh, you're so clever. You went back into the piece and brought up things that you talked about before. But it also reveals kind of how the author feels about her father. The dragon and the phoenix eye, they represent her father. And then the woman is probably talking about her mother. So by bringing it up again as a motif and as a repeating image, not only is it clever, but it also kind of shows us how the narrator feels. Like, why did my mom love my dad? He's not a good person. He's so mean. Um, and then that's one thing we talked about, kind of doing those callbacks, right? And then something else is her liking of the symmetric versus the asymmetric. So again, that's really good because it creates this contrast. Unlike her, she prefers symmetry. Like unlike her mother, she prefers symmetry. And that means that it shows that she wants to almost disassociate from her family, whether it's her mom who's in love with her father and her father who's like a mean guy, and how she kind of wants to break away from these things that she feels has been present in her life. So she doesn't really like her father or the asymmetry of life. She really prefers this idea of symmetry. And then one thing I want to do, you can look at the annotations on the slide, but where do you see the imagery concentrated? Like if you could name a line in this piece with a lot of imagery.
Maybe asymmetrical. Red highlights, bangs dangling over one eye.
hmm Yeah, so that's like anything that's related to the family or their relationship or the asymmetry or asymmetry of hair. So the one you talked about would be the symmetry or asymmetry of hair.
Mhm.
So we notice that these annotations show that at the beginning there's a lot of imagery, right? It establishes the mother's kind of character. The mother is like wild, crazy. She's the asymmetric one. And then it talks about her father's asymmetry. And that's the second main concentration of imagery. Right. And then the third main concentration of imagery is talking about herself and how she prefers the symmetrical. And again, the next concentrations are all about asymmetry or symmetry. And then I want you to notice how everything is concentrated around these key ideas. Either number one, the notion or idea of symmetry and or asymmetry and how it implies a greater idea about the narrator. So like asymmetry as a metaphor for bad things in life and this idea of chaos and not having order or control, whereas symmetry is a desire or need for control in someone else's life or someone's life. And then number two, the narrator's feelings about her mother, her father, and their relationship. The imagery kind of helps elucidate these moments, right? So it's important to think about when you're writing, how will you kind of concentrate your moments of figurative language? How will you concentrate your moments of imagery to kind of create this idea or emphasize certain parts of your story? And then, our class ended a little bit earlier today, but I'll just give you a brief overview of the homework. So for homework, we're going to be doing one word stories. And sorry to break your bubble but these stories are not just one word, but instead they're just taking one word from either one of the lists I have on the screen, or you can just pick a random word, and just write a 200 word story, or a poem titled after that word. So, for example, if your word was asymmetry, you'd write a poem or like a prose piece about asymmetry based on that word.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, essentially you're choosing a word, whether it's one of these words or any other word that you want to do, and then you're writing a poem or a short prose piece. For poetry, it could be under 10 lines, honestly. An 8-line poem is fine, or a prose piece. And it would be titled after any of these words. And I will make this more clear, and I'll also paste the word list in the Google Classroom. And then the next thing is you're going to be starting to think about your portfolio by kind of creating like an inspo chart. So do you know what Pinterest is?
No.
No? Okay. So Pinterest is basically like this site where there's a lot of photos and you can find inspiration for like a lot of different things. So kind of in a similar vein, we're going to start by creating an inspo chart or like an inspiration chart. So I hope this is kind of fun. And if you're not like kind of an artsy person, this might be kind of annoying. So I'm sorry, but essentially you want to have minimum 2 words, 2 photos, and 2 other writing works that you think will inspire your portfolio. So like whatever your portfolio is about, whatever it's centered around, you want to have 2 of each. And you can also add stuff like songs and articles, etc. Anything that kind of pertains to that same kind of topic or like notion that you want to center your portfolio around. And places you can definitely look for stuff is Pinterest, like I mentioned before. You can look at Spotify. And there's also a journal called The Offing. So they have like a section called microfiction, I think. So if you'd like to take like a microfiction piece and paste it directly there, they can fit on a page. Other good journals are like the Adroit Journal, Aurora Journal. So these are where those prompts came from, actually, the Aurora Journal. And then finally, Scholastic winners. So if you can't fit the whole piece, you can just put the title or maybe the cover if it's a book. And I would recommend making this on a Google slide. And then with that, you'll have like a 2 to 3 sentence explanation of what you did, why you kind of placed there what you placed. But yeah, so does that make sense? Like, do you understand how that portfolio assignment would essentially work?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, no questions?
Not really, but one thing. I noticed that some of the things that I've read Greek mythology before, and I noticed some of it is pulled from Greek mythology.
Oh, you mean these words?
Yeah. Some of them,
Like which one?
like deities and ambrosia.
Ambrosia, yeah. That's from Percy Jackson, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe those words speak more to you. That might be more interesting to write about.
Mhm.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So just make sure that's done. And then I'll see you next week.
Mhm.
And hopefully this class was interesting to you, and I hope you learned a lot about figurative language.
We'll see.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Mhm.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.